I do get the GraphQL question quite a bit. So I actually even have like a call out in the Notion page for the workshop in regards to that. So when we were building the fintech application, I mean, not a lot of banking platforms, I don't know if any banking platforms have migrated to using anything like GraphQL. So they're dependent on REST services. If your end users are able to consume GraphQL APIs, and sometimes you provide a REST or a REST and GraphQL API, that's absolutely fine. But I think the structure of the design of the API we used followed something called a HATEOS design. And people ask, like, what do you mean? What's implicit performance or explicit performance? Explicit performance, in my opinion, is any piece of code you are explicitly writing that is signaling you're making a performance improvement here. Wrapping something in a use memo is an explicit performance improvement. I'm wrapping this in a memoization function because I don't want to recalculate this multiple times. But if you have a good understanding of the framework or the library that you're using, you may not even have to use these explicit functions to optimize for performance. Implicit performance is understanding the framework or the library that you're using. BFF stands for backend for frontend. Maybe that takes a little bit of a minute to wrap around your head, but I've got a backend system. I've got my front-end system, and that's your typical interaction where your front-end queries something from your backend and it receives it. Your BFF pattern is I'm putting something in the middle. And this something in the middle could be your Next.js, API handler. It could be your Express handler in the middle. It can be its own Node.js microservice or any stack that's in the middle. It's something in the middle that does something. And that something depends on the type of BFF pattern that you apply. The one that I've applied the most in my work is the aggregation proxy. So this is a proxy that goes and queries information from somewhere, and then it aggregates it in a particular fashion, and then passes it to the front end. And in atomic design, you break things up in atoms, molecules, and organisms. And the reason why I really like the way that's structured is because atoms, you typically only pass primitive props to. You pass barely any props to. And atoms are the smallest components of your application. So those maybe are the piece of your application that render the most. So if you've got a table and you've got a label or some small little atom inside there and you've got 1,000 rows of that table, that's rendering 1,000 times. Whereas the molecule renders a little bit less and may still be passed primitives to. And then your organisms, you may be passing reference-based types to, or maybe passing components down to. And then over there, because those don't render as much, you don't have as much of an issue with causing a chain of rendering in your application. I think that's where I see performance issues happen the most.
Today, we're joined by Faris Aziz, staff front-end engineer at Small PDF, international conference speaker, and co-founder of ZurichJS. Faris specializes in Next.js, React, and front-end architecture at scale. Perfect for this podcast. With a career spanning early-stage startups to global platforms like Discovery, Eurosport, Filt, and Navro. Beyond building systems used by millions, Faris has led engineering teams, designed career frameworks from scratch, and contributed to open-source tools like Raycast. He's also deeply involved in the developer community, mentoring engineers to mentor crews, and curating talks for CTJS conference. Welcome, Faris.
That's a mouthful. Thank you, Dan. Really happy to be here.
It was a mouthful. You've done too much. You're like, come on,
right?
Slow down.
I know I've started using a virtualization, right, for the list of things that I've got to put on the website.
Always thinking about performance. That's good.
%, right? Only for the 3 users that visit my personal portfolio website.
But I am one of them just for this podcast, for sure. So let's start off. You have an impressive career. You've done so much. What got you into programming, actually?
Ooh, it was a little bit of an interesting one. I didn't go to university. That's what I tend to lead with, and so I was in this dilemma of like, okay, what do I do with my life? What do I do with my life? I've always been a fan of tinkering with things and breaking things down. I used to build my own drones. I used to like take Raspberry Pis and rip them apart. I used to I like breaking things. Not so much of a good idea now if I work on a production system, but anyways, I love breaking things. And before going into software engineering, I was actually a CrossFit trainer. I was a competitive athlete. And I used to, train nonstop. I used to have a lot of fun doing it. And I went to coding bootcamp after finishing high school. And before that, I had done a bunch of that fitness stuff. once I went to coding bootcamp, they teach you really how to learn, essentially. There's only so much you can learn in the 3-4 months. But right after finishing that, COVID hit, actually. My career didn't start as long ago as sometimes it may sound, but COVID hit. And when I went back from London to Geneva, Switzerland, that's where I originally was from, all the coaches in the region were no longer able to teach classes because we had all the COVID restrictions. And so they weren't able to do indoor classes. Gyms were no longer a thing. And slowly, as rules loosened up, there was the ability to have outdoor classes. And I was a little bit selfish and I wanted to keep myself busy. So how was I going to, use my new coding skills? I built an app to make that simpler. And what most coaches were doing at that time is using WhatsApp and Cash to organize. We're going to do a class at 6:00 in the morning here, whatever, bring me $10 or that's how we're going to figure this out. And I was like, that's not good enough. It seems like there's some things that could be automated or simplified over here. And so I challenged myself. I was like, let's just build a really quick, trashy React app that can enable class booking systems. And so you could just batch create a bunch of classes, handle payments with Stripe, and then, in no generic way possible, very much for my particular use case, just come and join and do classes. And it worked wonderfully until certain times that payments failed and whatever. And I would debug with a client in person after class and things like that. And it definitely didn't follow any best practices, but it was this wondrous entry point into software engineering and creating stuff and building things and debugging and just, getting in touch with value creation. And that was just such an incredible experience. And that's how I got into my first role, which funnily enough, I didn't write a single line of code in the interview process to get.
Why didn't you write any code?
They asked me to just demo the app that I had built. And so I just walked them through the GitHub code. And I was like, this is why it functions this way. This is why I made that choice. And I just talked. I'm a yapper. I just like talking. That's what I did. That's what I did through the interview process. And generally, I guess if they didn't feel like anything that I was saying wasn't valid. So when they, dug a little bit deeper and I gave valid justifications, it seemed to be enough, to get into the role. And it was absolutely fantastic.
And that's very cool. Congrats. I think we had a panel now in our meetup this week, React.js meetup, and we had really cool people on it. And I think all of them agreed that after you finish a bootcamp, after you finish university, to get into that role, you should build stuff. Like, don't
100%
wait for the projects to come to you. Like, go ahead and build as many projects as you can. Get your hands dirty and show them off, basically. So
solve personal problems. 100%. Everyone's got personal problems. Somebody wants a booking app to, be able to manage all their therapy sessions. Somebody wants to be able to make it easier to shop groceries, manage dog walks, whatever it is. It's like personal problems. There's so many interesting personal projects you can do, like building Netflix clones and YouTube clones, but those are things that already exist. You have so much more drive to be curious when you have personal stake in what you're building.
I think when I was doing interviews, one question I really, really liked asking was, what's an app idea that you always wanted to build, but never did? And then ask why. Why did you never do? Oh, of course, some answers could be like, I didn't have any money to build Netflix, but I really like to see the candidates' thought process about why they didn't build the app that they always wanted to build.
I actually, a couple of years ago when I was interviewing for roles, and I really like interviewing at startups, and it was in a stage where I was interviewing at pre-seed startups. I actually interviewed for, I think, a founding engineer position. And the person was asking me, like, what are your other passions? What are the other things you've built? And I actually explained them this fitness class booking app that I built. And I built that over 3 years. So I built an initial version that took a couple of weekends. And then that was my pet project, that every time I wanted to learn a new thing, I'd rebuild the application. It was built in REST. I want to do it in GraphQL, just switch the stack to GraphQL. If I want to do it in Next, whatever. So it was a playground, same system, different evolving stack. And so I expressed so much passion throughout that interview process for what I had built. He was like, you know what? You're not fit for this role, not because you're not capable, but because you should probably just go and pursue that. Go build it. And if you want to get funding for it, I can recommend you a couple of people. I think that's really cool.
So what happened with the app?
The app still exists. The app still exists. It doesn't have any users. I had shut it down at some point because too many DigitalOcean credits being used. But I progressed to different things. I think as software engineers, we love building things. We love toying around, tinkering, hacking. But the harder part actually isn't the building part. It's not the
Hmm.
technological part. It's the go-to-market and the selling part. And there's so much I had to learn from, a business perspective where, don't spend 3 years building an application, build a prototype so somebody could play with it and then put a waitlist page up. Or
Hmm.
understand product market fit, or not even product market fit. I really like this term called promise market fit. Don't build something and try to make it fit. Make a bunch of promises and see the promise that sticks. The promise
Okay.
that sticks is the one that you're going to see there's traction with and start building towards that. Meet promises bit by bit and build trust with people and then get family and friends to test it out. And so I didn't follow that approach to that application. I got too far deep into it, but it was an incredible learning experience. The purpose wasn't to have a go-to-market.
Of course.
And then I moved to building other applications that now I have had a more business-centric, savvy approach. And I've actually had less of a technical approach and more like vibe coding it half broken, but it's out in production being used. And you're building real features that real people are using, not focusing on the tiny piece of text in your footer that nobody's going to read.
Yeah, that's very cool. I actually have a friend who he's actually a backend and AI engineer.
Mm-hmm.
But what he does is he has all these ideas and he builds the landing pages of them.
Yeah,
And exactly what you said, a wait list and see which one gets traction with SEO. And he does a little bit of marketing for each of them. But he has like 20, 30 ideas like that in the wild, and he sees what sticks and what doesn't. Which I think is
100%.
pretty cool approach nowadays with
Yeah, you can build something incredibly fast and get validation and then iterate on the right stuff.
So, how was working actually across London, Switzerland, globally, basically? How this has shaped your engineering in general?
There are a couple of ways I like to answer that. The first is like different cultures really force you to think in different ways. When I was working predominantly in London, you're not just working with individuals based in London, you're working with teams that are based in India, based in Poland, based in Portugal. And so, a lot of people say that I have an American or an international accent, and that's really well. I'm Swiss. I'm born Swiss. I don't have that Swiss German accent or French accent tied to me, and that maybe evolved over time because I had to learn to internationalize my accent or speak in a way that is understood by a larger group of people. And that made me work on my communication skills. And something that I say when I begin a workshop is that anytime I say something and you do not understand it, you can make me pause and say rephrase. And if
Hmm.
I'm not able to say the same thing in 3 different ways and you understand it, that's my inability to communicate, not your inability to understand. That even draws from what we were taught as CrossFit trainers. When you learn to become a coach, you're taught 3 core ways to help teach somebody something or how to teach somebody's body to move. Some people don't have, mind body connection. So you have to use, either visual cues, tactical cues, or auditory cues. So, either you tell somebody something, you show somebody something, or, you touch their shoulder and you tell them it's going to move in that direction. And so working in multiple cultures really taught me that.
Mm.
Then beyond the communication stuff, there's also the drive. When you work in competitive regions, and like London is incredibly competitive in the best way possible, everyone is striving to do better. There's somebody there that's got to support their family, and they're, working to get towards a promotion. There's somebody else that's just really curious and, fought to be able to make their way into that one particular country. And everyone, or that one particular company, everyone there is trying to find ways to prove themselves. That's pushing the bar up for everyone. So if you have the energy, you're rarely going to be still. You're going to be working on side projects. You're going to be spending hours sometimes after work, digging down into that rabbit hole and figuring out, why does this particular thing not render? Like I was working on TV applications, why on earth, does this thing render on a Fire TV, but there's no way it's rendering on a Samsung TV? And I have to work with different, voice-over systems to make it accessibility compliant. And, otherwise I can't ship it in the US. There are a bunch of things around that. And so everyone's finding ways to level up the game, and that really pushes you as an engineer. And not only as an engineer, I learned that also when I transitioned from doing CrossFit in Switzerland to CrossFit in London. The amount of I improved my fitness by in just 6 months being in London versus 6 years in Switzerland was absolutely incredible because I was surrounded by the top of the top in terms of
Hmm.
athletes. doing things that I couldn't even think about. And so really, if you really want to run fast, you got to run with a bunch of people that are faster than you. Sometimes it's a blessing to be the dumbest person in the room.
Yeah, I think that's a good parallel with engineering as well, right? You're surrounded by rock star engineers. You just learn and sponge off of them as much as possible, I think.
100%. 100%.
So what led you to actually co-found ZurichJS?
I've always loved, learning and teaching, and I've always been fascinated by how communities have come together in other cities. Like Paris has an incredible meetup going on with JS Monthly in London. I mean, you've got an incredible community going on in Barcelona. Like I'm really keen to visit it. Elian's also got one in Belgium. Like these communities have something so special to them. They're people that drive the heart of it, and it helps people make friends. It helps people learn new things. Early on in my career, I thought I could get all my satisfaction, all my learnings from my main job. And
Hmm.
I learned very quickly that's just not going to be the case. You're going to have to find external sources of energy, external sources of learning, and communities are fantastic for that. And with ZurichJS, the reason we really started that is because I didn't feel like there were that many thriving communities in Zurich. And after starting ZurichJS, I was naive in saying that because I shortly learned that there were actually a lot of communities that are thriving over there, but they all have different approaches. And because they all had their own approaches, it meant that I could bring my own approach. And I learned so many things from the international communities and all the international conferences. I wanted to bring those into Switzerland. And I started the new role at Small PDF. But I'm based in Geneva, and so I'll commute 4 hours to the office. I was like, you know what? Let's start a meetup in the same place I'm starting my new job. Why not? Let's just do it. And so I'd given a talk at the React.js meetup in Zurich. It went really well. I met the guy Bogdan, who was going to be my co-founder, and we just vibed together. And it's like, you know what? Let's just give it a go and start it. What do we have to lose? Later, we found out it's a lot more work to actually get it done. But
It's a
I
lot of work.
mean, what we were able to do is something that I don't think is very common in the meta space, is that we've had some really heavy hitter international superstars come to Zurich. We've had Matteo Colinas come to Zurich, Elian from the who was an Astro maintainer came. I mean, you're hopefully going to come soon. We've had
Hopefully.
incredible people, friends of mine people that I like to call my friends, coming to Zurich, and we're having a great, space to be able to learn. We can have dinner together. We're able to, help enrich the community over there, and a lot of people have turned out to love it. Some people move to Zurich; they struggle to find friends. Switzerland sometimes is known to not be the most social place, and so you can feel a little bit isolated. So having places to just feel like you can just share positivity with people, and it's also a great medium for me to beta test my talks before I take them to conferences, and also sit back and learn how other people do talks. It allows me to not be in the speaking light and actually sit back and being in the listening and learning light, which I like to be in from time to time. I didn't also have a space to do that. So I love learning from people.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one, you're doing really unique stuff, and I think I'm gonna steal some ideas off of you because I feel like your meetup is super successful. But I think both of us had this thing, like we both started speaking at conferences first and
Yeah,
then said, okay, but why in my own city this is not happening?
100%.
Like we live in two of the most amazing cities in Europe, and we don't have what London does. Why not?
Yeah,
No. I
exactly.
think. And even now, like my meetup that I had last week, I was super impressed of the turnout because
Hmm.
it's August now. So I think usually people don't expect a lot of, at least in Spain, people take vacations, but it was
Yeah.
full. And it was like you said, people who just moved, people who want to like meet other people. And I think it was a really, really cool experience. And I'm thinking actually to do two meetups now. Like I'm doing one per
Wow.
month. Yeah, we have Barcelona JS here in
Hmm.
Barcelona, but it was off and off. The organizers are really busy, and
Yeah.
they approached me with the proposal to take it.
That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm actually thinking, I don't know yet if I should merge them or just do two. I'm still thinking. Maybe I'll see how yours works out and steal some ideas off of you.
We had a little bit of the same it takes a lot of effort. First of all, we also have the View Zurich
Hmm.
meetup, and there's also potential for us to be starting Stripe Zurich. and then Stripe Zurich. So I'm part of a pilot program with Stripe to be able to bring a more monetization or payments focused meetup into the region. And so the September event that we're doing is going to be sort of the pilot of the pilot. And so we're going to try to find a speaker from Stripe, and it's sort of going to be the entry point into the Swiss market of like, how do you level up, your monetization strategy more from a business perspective in developing markets and stuff like that, or what's their new stablecoin offering. So I think it's going to be really cool. The scaling the meetup itself is going to be an interesting problem, because how do you split multiple people, or how do you actually create a volunteering group that's actually really rigid, has autonomy, and it's actually not too far off of the approaches that you use for building engineering teams? How do you scale yourself at some point?
Yeah, and the meetup itself is like a small company. I feel like you have to have a go-to-market strategy. You're doing a lot of social media, a lot of outreaches. Finding speakers is hard. Like people that come for free and just talk in front of other people. It's not that easy.
Weirdly enough, that's the opposite problem that we have. We've booked out speakers for at least 6 months. So it's very hard to get a slot actually to speak in ZurichJS. We have at least 5 speakers that we've been unable to find slots for. So we have to redesign the structure of the meetups, and we're already planning the entirety of 2026 by the end of this weekend to be able to fit people in, because we want to have our pro events where we have international speakers come in, and we don't want to get rid of the community aspect. We want people to learn. We want people to be able to share things that they want to share. So we want to bring community stuff and social stuff, and like doing that all in one space and workshops too. That's going to be interesting.
That's really cool. And like I said, you're rolling in success. Meetup wise. So you've worked mostly with React, right? All your career?
Mostly with React. I'm currently working with, I think we're working with React 16, small PDF, React 16.8 or something like that. So like slightly older version. We don't have any of the fancy use transitions, and so on and so forth. So we're dealing with different types of problems. After I was working with Next.js, Pages router, it was, I think at a time we did transition to the app router, but I started going more to an engineering manager position. But it's always been flickering between React and Next.js.
And what do you like the most? I mean, it's also very like, React is unopinionated, Next.js is very opinionated.
Yeah.
What do you like most about both of them? And if you would start a project, what would you choose?
I think that's a devilish question, because it depends on the type of project. The answer to every single developer question is like, it depends.
Another CrossFit booking
Another
app.
CrossFit? Another CrossFit application, if it's going to be a self-serve application, I'm probably going to go these days for Next.js, just because of the server-side rendering capabilities and the simplicity of being able to choose the different rendering strategies. If you want to have your blog posts in one place, you statically render those at build time from a CMS. Then you want to be able to have your more client-side interactive pages. And I know you can do a lot of this setup also with React server components and so on and so forth. But like, I've liked the way that Next.js applications are structured in the opinionated way. That's the app router fashion of doing things, with the pages router fashion of doing things. And like, but if I was building like a portfolio website, and I'm actually rebuilding mine currently, I would, for example, go for Astro, something that's really, really lightweight, something that's really content focused. What I've liked always about Next.js is that, you can pick those rendering strategies, and there's a lot of community support for being able to plug in things like TanStack Query to be able to do really creative stuff in regards to prefetching in your get server-side props, or being able to manage caching at different layers, or being able to choose how you hydrate your cache and your state. And I think that's for applications that you're going to want to self-serve and have SEO prioritized, but then also have all that interactivity. That's really, really useful. I think you can also do that with frameworks like Astra. I mean, Astra's fantastic with their whole islands architecture. You're going to be able to place view components in one area if you want to, and you can place React on the other side. You can choose as much interactivity or JavaScript as you want. But there's also a level of like, I'm most familiar with Next.js. It's actually my time to build something is going to be a lot shorter.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of it, especially if I'm hiring a dev team and I'm hiring a dev team to build something. I may hire a dev team purely because there's so many people trained in React specifically, versus even if Astra may be a better solution for the platform that I'm building. And so there's all that learning curve that you have to have part of it, and all that documentation and all of the community support, like the amount of GitHub issues that there are out there to be able to read from, the amount of, even if you still use Stack Overflow, the amount of context that there is in React to be able to pull into, even if you're using ChatGPT, which has, maybe memory from pre-2023, there's going to be a lot more history there to pull from to be able to be creative with your submissions.
I totally agree. I feel my blog is also, and my entire platform is built in Astro, so I really like it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, like, you've worked with Next.js I really enjoy your talk where you discuss issues that happen at the 10 million users. So what are some common issues that happen with Next.js at scale?
So issues at scale is, if we take the example of that financial dashboard that I was working on, and with that financial dashboard, what we wanted to do is we wanted to represent in charts, all the transactions that you may have made for a particular time period. So what are the payments, pay-ins and payouts that I've made in the last 24 hours, in the last 7 days, in the last 30 days. And to be able to create those charts, you're going to want to fetch data from somewhere. And so ideally, you want to be able to have data populated as soon as the pages load. And so you're going to try and maybe prefetch something and get server-side props. When you're prefetching something and get server-side props, you tend to avoid the loading indicators and whatever on the front-end side because you're doing everything on the back-end side. But if your request takes a really, really long time to resolve, if it takes 2 seconds, 3 seconds to resolve, you're sending no HTML to the client. You're sending no HTML claim. To heck with any interactivity, you've got nothing for the user to see. They're going to abandon your page. And so the scaling issue there is that our backend endpoint that we had was always returning a really bloated payload.
Yeah.
And every time we returned a bloated payload, because we didn't have a BFF layer, backend for front-end layer at the beginning of iterating on that product, every time you wanted to ask for 5,000 users of data or 10,000 transactions or 15,000 transactions, you'd exponentially increase the loading time and the amount of load you'd put on the server and so on and so forth. And so seeing those blank pages were just not going to do you any good. So you have to start getting a little bit creative with resilience patterns and implementing timeouts and so on and so forth. I think that's one of the big things that we had seen but that isn't so much Next.js specific. That's just typically, keeping the server busy while there's nothing happening on the client. There's nothing specific to Next.js in that scenario. A lot of these scaling and architectural issues are framework agnostic for the most part. When you're talking about, performance issues, I think they probably land more on the React side of things in terms of things re-rendering too many times or suboptimal state management. And that can get quite tricky when you're dealing with a lot of data coming from a server, from a fetch request, and you're doing a really intensive data mapping. And especially if you've got a very interactive UI where you're reloading a lot of charts, and then you're clicking and you're showing 10 different widgets here and there, paginating a bunch of stuff. If you've suboptimally structured your state, and at the beginning we didn't use any state management library, we just went for context provider and then local state, which is actually quite fine depending on how you use it. Eventually we moved to Zustand. You can land yourself in a place where you're calling use callback and use memo multiple times, and then you're like, we might as well add use memo and use callback everywhere, or even use the memo wrapper higher order component around components, and just call it the de facto method of implementing anything in React. And so then you end up putting your linting rules in place to say, this needs a use memo, this needs a use callback. And you don't bother thinking about the structure of your data that you're passing into your application. And this is where the fundamentals of, forget about React, the fundamentals of JavaScript come into play. Because if you don't understand primitive types versus reference-based types, you're not going to understand how React reconciles. Yep. And keeping it as basic as possible, React reconciles easiest when you passing primitive types, because it's going to use something similar to like object.is under the hood to see if is this number equal to the previous number in terms of the props that I'm receiving? Okay, don't bother re-rendering it. It's the same as it was before. So understanding how to take all the data that your application is receiving from your multiple API endpoints, and then also mapping those either at a BFF level, or before you set it into state in a structure that is your components are going to receive the most primitive props possible actually has a cascading effect on how performant your applications are. And that's where you get to component architecture. And there's this in workshops, I have this section of component architecture for implicit performance. And people ask, like, what do you mean? What's implicit performance or explicit performance? Explicit performance, in my opinion, is any piece of code you are explicitly writing that is signaling you're making a performance improvement here. Wrapping something in a use memo is an explicit performance improvement. I'm wrapping this in a memoization function because I don't want to recalculate this multiple times. But if you have a good understanding of the framework or the library that you're using, you may not even have to use these explicit functions to optimize for performance. Implicit performance is understanding the framework or the library that you're using, and then maybe using something like atomic design. And in atomic design, you break things up in atoms, molecules, and organisms. And the reason why I really like the way that's structured is because atoms, you typically only pass primitive props to. You pass barely any props to. And atoms are the smallest components of your application. So those maybe are the piece of your application that render the most. So if you've got a table and you've got a label or some small little atom inside there, and you've got 1,000 rows of that table, that's rendering 1,000 times, whereas the molecule renders a little bit less and may still be passed primitives to. And then your organisms, you may be passing reference-based types to, or maybe passing components down to. And then over there, because those don't render as much, you don't have as much of an issue with causing a chain of rendering in your application. I think that's where I see performance issues happen the most. It's when you trust the linter, ignore your gut.
I like this. I like it. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned it a couple of times about this BFF approach about backend
Yeah.
for front-end architecture. Can you explain it? I think not many people know about it, when to use it, what it is, like in layman's terms, or we can go as deep as you want, but I'm really curious.
It's a very fancy way of just saying like a proxy or something, a middleman to your platform. Yeah. BFF stands for backend for frontend. Maybe that takes a little bit of a minute to wrap around your head, but I've got a backend system. I've got my frontend system, and that's your typical interaction where your frontend queries something from your backend and it receives it. Your BFF pattern is I'm putting something in the middle. And this something in the middle could be your Next.js, API handler. It could be your Express handler in the middle. It can be its own Node.js microservice or any stack that's in the middle. It's something in the middle that does something. And that something depends on the type of BFF pattern that you apply. The one that I've applied the most in my work is the aggregation proxy. So this is a proxy that goes and queries information from somewhere, and then it aggregates it in a particular fashion, and then passes it to the front end. And the reason I like this pattern the most, and there's a lot of debate around it, is because if I'm, making 5 queries to this backend endpoint that's returning 1,000, elements in its array per request, and aggregating that together and passing to the front end, it's a much lighter payload than just passing all of that all the way to the front end. And so what's interesting here is that if you are the front-end engineer working on this, you're working on a Next.js application, you use the API routes, you're empowering yourself to change the data in a way that you would have previously been stuck asking a backend engineer to evolve their API with. And if you're working in a product company where your backend purely serves your front end, you can just ask, hey, I want a charts endpoint. And this charts endpoint should take the same data from this database, but it should just change the data structure to be passed to me. But if you're working in a fintech, you've got to abide by deprecation policies, and you can't just create new endpoints whenever you want to, because the API that you may be interfacing with for your front end may be the same API that users are using externally and companies are connecting into. So that's where you have a little bit of issue of like, I just can't go to the backend and ask them to change the way the endpoint works. The way the endpoint works is a dependency for multiple other products to use. So it's been designed with potentially a use case in mind that isn't the use case for your front end. So if we go back to the story of like, I need to create this chart data and I'm receiving back, I think in the example that I give in my talk, you get a 2.3 megabyte payload that comes back when you get all of the requests resolved. I think each of the 5 requests is like 660. Actually, don't know how much each one was, but anyways, it's 2.3 megabytes in total. What I can do at this proxy level is that I can query for that information, and I can write whatever algorithm or whatever mapping I want to and test it using whatever performance tools I want to, even if you want to use basic logging to see how long it takes to start the process and how long after the iterations you're done with the process. I can optimize what is the best data structures to use to be able to manipulate this and map this into whatever I need to. So you try to make your proxy not be a bottleneck of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
Once you've turned it into the structure you want to, you actually most likely want to turn it into a structure that you're going to not have to map at all on the front end, but you're going to pass it directly to the components in the front end. And so what am I trying to do for thinking about like, how do I build this in a way that's good for React reconciliation? I'm going to try to only return as much as I can. And for some charts, that is exactly what you can do. You're going to return some sort of a data structure, which is going to return a bunch of numbers, or maybe it's an array of numbers or so on and so forth, but you're going to be able to return primitives that you can just pass directly to your props, and it's going to be really easy to reconcile against that. But that's not the only benefit. If I'm receiving all this massive payload initially directly to the front end, it's not passing through a proxy, I may have to cache that payload too. And if you are caching in local storage or session storage, or wherever it is, there's a limit to how much you can cache there. It's got a 4 megabyte payload depending on the browser that you're using. So if I have the 5 requests that equal 2.3 megabytes, and I, have other requests that I'm making that are of the same density of payload, or then if I just double the amount of requests that I'm making, I've already reached the limit of my local storage. And so
And I'm
having the
guessing you
BFF,
can also cache it between users. You can have a
yes,
in-memory cache in the BFF that 5, 6, 7 users get the same response fast.
you could do that, but then cache and validation also becomes incredibly complex across that. And so like maybe you want to make your life simple and you just want to keep the BFF layer just down. And you don't want to have any caching there. And you can just use in-memory caching with Tanstack Query or offline caching with Tanstack Query, and you make your life very easy over there. But then potentially you're turning that 2.3 megabyte payload into a 666 byte payload, which is what I show in the example I talk most of the time. And then you're just caching a very minimalistic data structure. Maybe it's an object that's got 5, 6 key value pairs for the chart components that it's being passed to. That can be an incredible difference. And if your front end is only one of many clients, let's say you've got a mobile application too that also needs that chart data, you can then have that same proxy serve both of those. And then maybe if that proxy, again, is serving multiple applications, then you want to maybe consider caching at the proxy level in case the same user is logging in across multiple devices or multiple of your platforms, and you can associate the cache with the user or something of that sort. But that's where it can be really powerful. There's also another example around that I like to give is that I travel a lot. I travel, sometimes in trains and planes, and the mobile connection that I'm going to have on my phone isn't always stable. Sometimes I got a 3G connection, 4G connection, sometimes it cuts entirely. And so if I'm downloading a 2.3 megabyte payload and making multiple requests, there's a chance some of those fail. Then I have to individually retry one out of the 4 of the other ones. I keep the data and state somewhere, and there's a lot of complicated reconciliation against the multiple requests that you have to make. And so it can be just much easier to, again, if you're deploying this as an infrastructure service or as a function as a service, all the egress or ingress traffic actually has a big impact on your application, because I'm having this maybe function as a service query that 2.3 megabytes of payload, and then I'm only passing 666 bytes to my client. So my client only has to have enough bandwidth to query for those 660 bytes. So I have a stable bandwidth at my infrastructure service or function as service level, because that's hosted somewhere maybe in AWS or Cloudflare. So that's where the bulk of the network request is being made. And then I'm passing the minimum that I need to my client. So I'm putting a lot less pressure on the bandwidth of my mobile device. And so you actually make it much performant in that.
So it's basically you can have like lambdas or edge
Exactly.
functions on.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's a cool approach. But let's say you have a React Next application, right? So you loaded the first page. The next application makes a request to the BFF.
Yeah.
Let's say the BFF is written in Node or whatever. But you've rendered the page. You click a button. That button makes a request to your next application. And then the next application makes a request to the BFF, and the BFF makes a request to like 3 or 4 microservices or gateways or whatever, and then aggregates the data, and then it passes to the Next.js, and Next.js re-renders the page, basically.
Exactly. It doesn't have to even re-render the entire page. It has to re-render the dependent components, because then when you're using TANSTACK query, you're only going to only have dependent components subscribed to that network request, and maybe only updates 2 or 3 widgets. And that way you can also have multiple BFFs. You can split those up because maybe some may resolve faster than others.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can then have multiple widgets render at different times. And so maybe your biggest widget that has the biggest amount of data may take 10 seconds to render, whereas another one wants to render in 2 seconds. You don't want a single BFF making queries to multiple different sources. You may want to just split that up by having one BFF serve one chart, unless the data being returned can be used by multiple charts. Maybe I have one transaction chart, and then I have one chart in a multi-tenant application about how many users have been active in the last couple of days. I'm getting it from 2 different data sources. So why am I creating a bottleneck with one request to, populate 2 charts? So you want to be able to segregate that as much as possible.
That's very interesting. And at the infrastructure level, I'm guessing these BFFs have to be protected. How do you handle authentication and tokens between?
So I think what we didn't actually do that when we were implementing that. We didn't bother with handling any of the authentication stuff. But I think what you were able to do, and we did this a little bit down the line, is that whatever authentication the upstream service required, which was your end, the backend that the BFF would query, you would just pass that along. So whatever bearer token you needed for the end API, you would pass that same authentication structure, that same bearer token through the proxy. And that would just pass it along to the API. And then the API, the root API, would be responsible for the authentication and authorization. For the most part, though, in the application that we were working in, your groups and scopes would be shared across whatever the authentication method that you were using in. So you would log in, you would get your JWT token, you'd get your groups and scopes, and that in any case would tell you what charts you were able to access or not. So you may not have been able to query particular pieces of data in the first place. But then, of course, you can also figure out what endpoint you're using and then query that separately in Postman. But generally, the bearer token is what we used, and we passed it along. We didn't do anything fancy. I don't act to be any security expert around that, but I'm sure there are a couple of loopholes you could exploit.
Yeah, no, I remember when we had this problem. Like we had a main gateway, which was sort of like a BFF, but it was a huge monolith written in Java, and then we had 1,000 microservices doing crazy stuff in the background. But the communication between the gateway and microservices was not secured because it was in the same Kubernetes cluster. And technically, you couldn't get access to it unless you hit the gateway, which I'm guessing it's the same thing you said. But if you get access by something, like, something happens that you are not secure and you get access to the cluster, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Which was such a big security problem that basically it took us like a month or 2 months or 3 months to fix it. I remember
Which
it
is
was
also
crazy.
interesting because sometimes having that BFF layer where it's only returning you chart data is probably a lot better to be able to only access the chart data than all of the payload that made up the chart data, the user IDs, the user emails, and so on and so forth. But in any case, that's no issue.
So if you would have to build it from scratch, would you do a BFF or would you use something like GraphQL? Because I'm guessing GraphQL is a little bit similar in what it does. So, except that you give the client access to request whatever it wants.
So when it comes to, I do get the GraphQL question quite a bit. So I actually even have like a call out in the Notion page for the workshop in regards to that. So when we were building the fintech application, I mean, not a lot of banking platforms, I don't know if any banking platforms have migrated to using anything like GraphQL. So they're dependent on REST services. If your end users are able to consume GraphQL APIs, and sometimes you provide a REST or a REST and GraphQL API, that's absolutely fine. But I think the structure of the design of the API we used followed something called a HATEOS design. And it evades me a little bit what HATEOS stands for, but the idea was that when you query an endpoint, it also tells you in that domain, whether it's users or transactions, what are the other endpoints you may want to query to access different types of data. So it's sort of like a REST API approach to handhold you through the array of API endpoints that are there available. So if you have an example of, transactions and you request all transactions, you may also want to request a transaction by ID or a transaction with a particular filter or something of the sort. And so it sort of gives you extended options, and that was something that was really cool. You could technically say that because GraphQL is self-documenting with all its schemas, that you are able to do the same thing and see that within a particular schema, what are all the options that I can query for. But when it comes to also designing your caching with GraphQL, you are making a post request to then get all the data from one endpoint. You're not segregating into multiple endpoints on this. I think you can do that also with federated GraphQL. But because you're not segregating, it actually makes sometimes caching a little bit more complicated, because I think the setup's a little bit different when it comes to if you're using something in Tanstack query. You want to be able to segregate your cache and saying that, with all these requests that I'm making, by this endpoint, use this endpoint as the key, create a hash out of this and use that as the key for the cache that I have. Whereas the endpoint being the same for everything in GraphQL, you have to now figure out a different mechanism for segregating and creating your hashes and keys. And like, okay, maybe I define the key here for this. Maybe I use the Tanstack query that I have for my use query. And so I think it just changes the approach you go about with caching. It doesn't make anything impossible. But then because you're also breaking your traditional REST API, querying approach using a post request versus a GET request, you start to also then break down, how do you traditionally break down the idea of like idempotency and what request means that a request is idempotent. Like post request is traditionally not idempotent, but technically if you're making a query in GraphQL, it is idempotent because for the same query, you're going to get the same information. Yep. So there's also a little bit of a mental model shift that I don't know if more of these all these fintech platforms have actually migrated towards that mental model shift, and a lot of people are just used to using REST.
Yeah,
but that's just my approach for it. It's also like whoever you're servicing may just find that much easier to work with.
I really like the explanation that, okay, you query an endpoint and that endpoint helps you along with other endpoints that you can use. It's sort of a little bit like TRPC in a way, right? Like you connect to a service and then you have access to everything. I think that's really, really cool. Would you recommend TRPC? People use it, and what's your take on it?
I've not used it in a production system before. I've played around with it. For me, it's much easier to just deal with types. And I know with GraphQL, you can take your schemas, you can generate types out of your schema. And then I think the most difficult setup of it all is if you are using REST APIs, because then you have to follow API first development, where this open API spec is written first, and then you do type code gen afterwards and generate all the types, and then you can use it on your front end. That becomes more of a headache. So if you want just simplicity from a typing perspective, I think it's just a fantastic library to use. But I haven't used it extensively at a production level. So I wouldn't be able to tell you all the little things that go wrong with it.
We used it a little bit and I like it. Of course, it's amazing in your editor when you're coding to see the entire API, which I feel it is really cool. And the types and everything, the model. And it sort of helps, like if you're used to using RESTful APIs, at one point at scale, you're going to need contract testing between the front end and different back end, and the back end between different consumers. It's going to grow to a point where you're going to need it. Otherwise, if they just remove a key, which happens quite often in an API somewhere, then all your system goes down, right? You don't want that. So,
and you also assume that sometimes your API follows REST design principles. Not all APIs do. Yeah. And that's where that's problematic, because every API has different ways that they deal with errors and error structures. And where if you can, if you use one or two query parameters, it works fine. But then if you combine 5 different ones in the wrong way, you have no idea how to comprehend the error that's coming out. And so having that type safety also with the parameters that you're passing to your query, it can make a world of a difference, because you don't want to even enter the scenarios where you have to decipher the error and the lack of logs that don't tell you why this combination of query parameters doesn't work for your endpoint.
That's true. One other cool architecture design that we did at Glovo was Glovo was a food delivery app, and we had like all food delivery apps. You had like an Android app, an iPhone app, and the web, and all three had the same API. Mm-hmm. And for our store pages, we decided to implement server-driven UI. So basically, the API would actually write the entire front end. So it will
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, in the header, write this. In the body, you have this, that's a row. And then the front end was just one big factory that received props and
Yeah.
drew everything from the back end, which worked amazing when you have like front end iOS app and Android app. If you need to hide a button, it automatically hides it for all three. I think it's a little against the guidelines from the Apple Store, but everyone goes with it. Famously, Airbnb is written like this, which
Just
I
Eat is
think
also written like this.
really that's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. How do you know that?
I get delivered a workshop at the Just Eat offices.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So there were like every time I'm giving a workshop somewhere, I like to make it personal. So I like to investigate what's the app, how it's built, because like, again, the way I say something doesn't make sense for everyone. And like think of delivering workshops or talking a little bit like observables. And observables in the sense like I have a different, everyone is subscribed to something different, a stream
Mm-hmm.
of information differently. I may be outputting 5 streams of information. I'm talking about architecture, I'm talking about front end, I'm talking about back end, but maybe you only care about the problem space that you're dealing with, which is server-driven UIs or whatever. So maybe you're thinking about large payloads, XYZ, how to run A/B tests, feature flags, whatever. And so maybe out of the 5 streams of information I'm talking about, you're only subscribed to one of them. And so you're wasting a fourth of your time potentially in the conversation. So I'm interested in saying, what are the streams you want to subscribe to? What do you want to unsubscribe from? And how do I deliver the right information to you?
Yeah, that's a cool strategy. I did something similar in CityJS. I asked the people in my workshop what they want to learn,
Mm-hmm.
and I focused on what the majority wanted. Of
Yeah.
course, it sucks for that
Couple
one
of
guy who
tangents.
wanted to vibe code, but yeah, so very cool.
Yeah.
Time flew by. It's insane. Let's do like a lightning round, and I can ask you
I'm
first.
never good at keeping things short.
I'm really, I'm gonna ask a long question also because
Okay.
I'm really curious. What's your day to day like as a staff engineer at Small PDF?
Making sure production is still working. I mean, it's really interesting because it's small PDF. Like the scale is insane. It's really wow. Like I think in a month we have 28 to 30 million active users. So when you
Okay.
ship something to production and it breaks, you will know really, really, really fast. And so a lot of what I do is more strategic. Like the code isn't the hardest part. I'm trying to find how to evolve the stack in ways that are going to make us a little bit future proof or not prone to issues that we may have had in the past. And so at Small PDF, actually, what's really interesting is that we don't really have a lot of unit tests, integration tests, or end-to-end tests. We have 0 end-to-end tests. We're growing in the way that we are building observability into our
Mm-hmm.
stack. Like what I was working on in the last 2 weeks was we have a lot of subscription plans. And so when you're fetching subscription plans, I want to know in which countries are we unable to fetch the right plans for what currencies, what's the failure rate, how is it trending compared to last week? Because, you're serving people across the globe. And with a monetization strategy, you're not going to just serve them US dollars in a singular price. You have different prices in India, different prices in Switzerland, different prices. You may even have multiple different prices within the US because we run a lot of A/B tests and you do run a lot of geo pricing experiments. So based in the US, you may want to see that, okay, if does a lower subscription price increase the trial to pro conversion rate or does it worsen it? And so I have to think about how do you run all these experiments at scale? How do you know within 15 minutes if somebody's deleted a plan from where we have subscription plans and for some reason in Brazil we no longer are able to serve you localized plans? How do you find that information out really fast? So I'm working a lot on the observability side of things. I'm also working on the developer experience side of things where once you have to debug something, what's the mean time to resolution?
Mm-hmm.
We don't really use DORA metrics, but I like to take DORA metrics as inspiration and like, okay, how do I reduce the mean time to resolution? It's like, how does this error that's popped up in the system that we use getting me to finding out what the end solution is? So we use, for example, a strategy called error tags that I helped introduce. and there may be multiple names for it, but error tags is giving like an ID identifier to a very particular error, and there can only be one ID in the entire application. So when that error pops up, I copy that error, I paste it into my IDE, and I found the one instance of it. That's just if your source maps aren't correctly configured. If anything goes wrong, you can see a chain of IDs that you're able to use and see where those things happen in the code, because that's not always very, very apparent. And so I also work on helping build our orchestration system, which was something that we introduced this year, on how do you actually create what I like to call an air traffic control system for all the payment gateways that we use to be able to have payments. We had an outage happen, and this is coming up in my talk that I'm going to do at What the Stack. We had an outage happen where, by mistake, the API keys for Braintree were removed for 12 hours. We were unable to process any PayPal payments for 12 hours. And so my role is helping design the playbook of how do you get back to operating from a payments perspective as fast as possible. That outage was for 12 hours, but with the orchestration system that we're developing, you can actually flip the switch and redirect all PayPal payments to Stripe in like 5 lines of code from Braintree instead. And you can actually be operating without having fixed the root cause of the issue in like 20 minutes. And so I'm there to alleviate all issues around the beginning of the funnel and the end of the funnel. So conversion and retention at scale and in all the countries, and figuring out what's the right data we need to collect and how to collect it to understand what's the next thing we need to evolve in the product.
That's pretty cool. I love it. It's a difficult job though, no? It's stressful a little bit.
It is stressful when you put do not disturb on and then the on-call starts, but I don't think it's stressful because we've got a really great culture. I mean, we're not VC backed, so you don't have that stress of reaching certain revenue targets. Like naturally, when you have an outage, you're going to do a post-mortem and so on and so forth. But if you have the right mindset, stress isn't necessarily something that it becomes too much of a concern, because then the question really is, why are you stressed and why are you lacking confidence? The way we feel and the way we communicate in engineering can be a code smell or a culture smell in and of itself. And I have this entire separate conference talk called Engineering Without a Safety Net, where it works and where it hurts. Where if you say things like, I think it works this way versus I know it works this way, what are all the ways that you communicate that add to your anxiety and your stress? And so how can you take the way you feel and you communicate and change your approach to engineering to give you the confidence you need to sleep at night? Because outages are going to happen. Things are going to break. What do you do to create the right incident management strategy? What do you do to know what the steps you need to take are to resolve something when you're super sleepy at 3 a.m. and you just got an on-call trigger? And what stresses you is the unknown. And so we always have unknowns in engineering. How do you figure out what those unknown unknowns are and known knowns are, or known unknowns? And what's really interesting for that is you can even use a RAIDs framework, which I really like using, which is like when you're developing a product, what are your risks, assumptions, issues, and dependencies? Like, just be curious and find ways to give yourself the information you need to have that peace. Stress shouldn't be a thing. It's something you have to live with, at least.
That's a very good philosophy. But you mentioned you don't have tests, which it's a little surprising, to be honest. But what other processes you have in place? Like you mentioned postmortems and stuff like that, but what else do you have? The observability thing, I love it. I think that I subscribe to it. It's really important.
Yeah.
But what other processes you have in place to make sure the engineering culture is healthy, that people feel safe pushing code to production?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it all works on trust. So there's no such thing. I mean, naturally, nobody's deploying at noon on a Saturday, but there's no such thing as you have to get 4 reviews from this particular person and follow this exact process. Each individual engineer is entrusted that they have done the research that they need to. They have done quality assurance on the product themselves. Whether you've clicked things around, switched the A/B test states, checked in different browsers responsibly, you're responsible end to end. And if something breaks, you're responsible also for reverting it. And that's a really cool thing to have in a culture, because if you have ownership and accountability, that also helps build what is your technical debt strategy. Because if you suffered through a problem, if I did something in production and I felt things were really fragile and I kept breaking things, it's not 100% my fault. Like I think there wasn't any linting or there wasn't any checks or validation checks for a YAML file that I edited once. I edited it incorrectly and I took down like South Korea and Japan. So for 45 minutes. And I didn't even realize. I didn't get an alert or anything of that. And like that's really concerning for a global business.
Yeah.
There was no concern. There was no like a consequence to that. But I myself was like, oh my God, like I'm now scared of editing YAML files. And so I want to take ownership of that. I was like, okay, how can I make sure that never happens again? And I am in charge of going and finding that stuff to make sure that I don't make that mistake again. And now you could say, oh, is the culture now you're going to have to make a bunch of mistakes to figure out what's the right stuff to do. But slowly you then build this gut sense, this intuition for like, oh, if I touch that, it's going to break this. So actually the code reviews become incredibly interesting. It's a really interesting approach to coding reviews that we do, where there's so much domain knowledge. When you see a code review and you see a PR and it's only, 100 lines of code, which maybe is not that much, sometimes there can be 30 comments because that 100 lines of code touches 100 dependent systems. And so it's about how much domain knowledge have you acquired in all those dependent systems and how well do you know the product? Because it's not like culture of like, this is the PM's responsibility, this is the QA's responsibility, I'm going to hand it off in a stop. It's not for me to think about if this thing works or not. I just did my code. I take the end-to-end responsibility. And then you have stake in the game. And that builds a culture of questioning why things the way they are. It builds a culture of owning the end-to-end solution and then building that curiosity of like, how can I make this better, not just for myself, but for the entire team.
It's really cool. I love it. And how do you relax? I mean, you're doing so much. You're speaking. You're hosting meetups, workshops. Your full-time job of like not making Japan and South Korea work. What do you do for fun?
What I do for fun, I love racing motorbikes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're high-end speed all the time.
Yeah, high-end speed. I love traveling. I love people. I love going and hanging out with my friends. I love, as much as I love building stuff, I love going out in nature. And I think motorbiking, what I love about it is may not be the speed or anything like that, but it's the fact that you are in tune with the engine and in tune with the environment. And if you don't pay attention to the environment around you, you're going to get killed. Simple as that. And what's nice is because I operate in this realm of I receive 500 Slack messages, I get calls here, I have these LinkedIn messages and these posts. There's an oversaturation and overcharge of things going through my head. And the ability to force myself to just focus on one thing, the air around me, the cars passing by, the weather, the road, it allows me to recenter myself. And then, as much as I may have activities dedicated to relaxation, I love the idea of it can be relaxing just to do the community stuff. I don't find it work. Yes, it's stressful to find sponsors. It's stressful to make sure that the schedule works. It's stressful to, when you haven't filled up the workshop seats, but you have to enjoy that ride. You have to enjoy the chaos. You have to enjoy all of it. And at the end of the day, I've got a smile on myself, even if I was up at 6 a.m, had to travel 4 hours to Zurich, do the whole workday, run a 5-6 hour, meetup. I'm sleeping at 2 a.m. and I may be exhausted, but I'm happy. And it's the best exhaustion possible, similar to when you go and do a really intense workout. You're happy afterwards, even though you're in a little bit of pain. And so I learn ways to enjoy the process. And that just means that I don't have to have that dedicated relaxed time. I just maybe have dedicated time to work other parts of my brain to refocus. Because I'm also a big believer in the more decisions you make per day, the less valuable each decision. So find ways to make, consistent, small, meaningful step forward in whatever you want to do. That's why sometimes people will say, why do you wear the same clothes for like 5 days in a week? And maybe Friday and Saturday, I get a little bit more stylish.
I love this, the small decisions. And I also think it's a parallel, right, between racing motorbikes at speed, making sure you don't die, with handling 25, 35 millions of payments per month across 30 countries, or how many countries you guys are operating in. So I think it's a really cool parallel.
Just
You
make it
love
part of the
high
game.
stakes.
I love high stakes. I love challenges. I love being surrounded by people that are much smarter than I am. I think there's so much to profit in the world. I love opportunities. I think the biggest problem or feedback I receive is I don't say no enough. And I know saying no is an important skill, but there's so much that life has to offer. Jump at the conference, jump at the opportunity, take a leap of faith in yourself, do something different. And you'll find that as much as time passes when you're having fun, time also passes a lot slower when things are not as mundane. So
That's
find a
true.
way to have something special every single day, just like also find a way to have small successes every single day. A really cool coach I had when I was at CrossFit training said that even if you couldn't lift 200 kilos today and you're trying to have a personal record, drop it down to 150 kilos and lift it off the ground. No matter what you do, you leave the gym with a success and you leave with a smile.
I love that. It's a good inspirational, motivational actually quote to have. And I'm the same. Like I like doing a lot of stuff. I like, and yeah, I think it's really fun and more people should do it for sure.
Yeah.
Final question. Time has passed so fast. Recommend me some books, something you adore. Doesn't have to be programming, but whatever you want. I actually buy as soon as a guest on my podcast recommends me a book, I order it the next day.
I'm
So I
sure you will have read it before, but The Pragmatic Programmer.
I have that one.
100% you will have had that one. And I love that book because there's so many small little pockets of wisdom in there. Like
Hmm.
don't leave don't leave the window broken, because people
Hmm.
will see it and then they'll, encourage, people to leave things in a bad state, or a little bit of Boy Scout principle, leave things in a better state than you found it. And they're just small things that you can carry in the way that you act. And I think a lot of people can figure out how to solve the hard technical problems. That's actually not the hard part. It's the way you carry yourself, the way you think, the way you approach problem solving, the way you approach being pragmatic, and the way you approach human beings. Because you don't have to be in a leadership position to be a leader, but you have to find ways to approach problems in a way that keeps you humble and the way that carries people forward in a positive way. And that means a lot more than all the nitty-gritty technical stuff, because that you can learn, that you can read from documentation.
And something non-technical. What would you recommend someone read?
Not non-technical. I'm bad at this because I actually don't read any non-technical books.
Okay.
Yeah,
What
that's not
about
that's
a what about a TV show or a movie that you really loved?
I love Matrix. I love Matrix. I
Really?
love Star Wars. Classic typical nerd.
Even the new one? I've never watched the new one.
The new one's good. Well, it's a little bit I love the fact that there are motorbike scenes in there, so that's what gets me.
Okay.
As the
So that's where
nostalgia
the
aspect.
motorbikes came from. It's from the Matrix.
So actually, this is a bit of a fun story. The fourth Matrix came out during COVID, and I was not able to leave to the cinema to go see it. And because I have experience building TV applications, I actually built my own Netflix at home, but not like a mock Netflix, actually one that could stream from a popcorn time server, which, yes, in Switzerland, it is legal to download
Okay.
a movie from a popcorn server. It is not legal to upload a movie to a popcorn server. I don't even think it's working at this point, but it uses a framework called Lightning, which is a WebGL-based framework that the Comcast company created. And so I just deployed it on a Fire TV, and I had my own Netflix just at home because I wanted to be able to watch the latest Matrix when it came out. And so even again, finding ways to use personal problems to create something cool for yourself. I think is really interesting. And I would recommend looking into building TV applications because it's a weird space. You have to solve problems in ways that you don't traditionally do it with web development. You have to use a lot of polyfilling. There's some HTML elements that are supported. And so you've got to get creative. You're not looking at React or even Preact. You're looking at like bare bone stuff. Or how are you using your HTML components, custom HTML components, elements, and web components? And like, how are you dealing with the fact that you have hardware accelerated, hardware accelerated stuff on these set-top boxes, and how do you optimize for the amount of nodes that are there and loading intensive images and doing all these CSS tricks, because a lot of TVs work with spatial navigation. So you're actually using a lot of CSS tricks to be able to detect what are the elements that are closest to you to understand what to navigate and change focus to. and you have to solve for accessibility in ways that aren't just semantic HTML. Semantic HTML is the structure of the skeleton of the page where you put your H1s here and your buttons here. But if you have to create a button using a div that isn't using a traditional HTML button element, how do you creatively still solve for the accessibility issue so that blind people can use it? I think it opens up a window of developing apps in a way that gives you a lot of respect for how we do it today in with more versions of the libraries and tools that we use.
And is there something similar to how, Ionic handles, you write it in Angular and it compiles to mobile, or do you have to write them in a specific language? How do you
So
usually write?
if you're using, what are they called? Roku, you're writing it in BrightScript, as far as I remember. That's what the name of it is. I always struggled with that one. Predominantly because you have to deploy to multiple TV types, like your Fire TVs, your Samsung TVs, your Comcast set-top boxes, or whatever. You actually create, I think, Android application wrappers, which are web views, and so you're just plugging in a website. Your TV
Okay.
applications most of the time are web applications. It's just
Mhm.
that you have to support browsers that you cannot test for on your computer. So you have
Mhm.
to connect the set-top boxes directly to your computer and so on and so forth.
Okay, that's interesting. Really cool. Thank you, Faris, for joining. I think I had my longest session today ever, so it's a new personal record. I think we talked about a lot. It was amazing having you on. I don't think I've had so much fun and laughed so hard on my past podcasts so far. So thank you
Thank
for
you so
taking the
much,
time.
Dan.
Hopefully, I meet you either in Zurich sometime soon or in Alicante for sure.
Or Barcelona.
Or Barcelona. If you're in Alicante, why not drop in Barcelona? It's so close. Yeah. Maybe we
But yeah,
do the meetup.
I appreciate it. And there's so many more topics to dig into. So like, it sounds like a session 2
I
is
think
in the.
I haven't even asked you about your time at Eurosport and doing video streaming and
I haven't even talked all the monetization stuff. There's so much craziness. I even wanted to dig into like how do you design engineering teams and all the problems at scaling engineering teams, because there are two parts. You can actually, from a psychological perspective, see your code base can actually give a hint at like all the psychological dynamics in play with your engineering
Mhm.
teams, all the personality types, and then also like how does using Spotify models or shape up or different team structures actually have different impacts on your code base and the way you ship and all this Dora metric stuff. And like, how do you actually get to shipping 300 times a day? I think there's so much more to explore in this space, and I can't wait
I
for it.
love it. Let's have a session just on engineering management. I
Done.
really think it's really cool. For sure. Let's do a part 2. I think we left too much on the table.
Cool.
Cool. Thank you, Faris. See you.
Thank you. Bye.